And now moving on ahead with our next talk with Dr. Dietrich Schmidt, Vogt, Professor at the Kunming Institute of Botany and Head of Research Programs at ICRAF's East and Central Asia Regional Office. Before joining ICRAF, he was affiliated with the Asian Institute of Technology in Thailand and the South Asia Institute of Heidelberg University in Germany. As a geographer specializing in landscape ecology, he carries out and publishes research on a wide range of topics, but on a land use and environmental change in the Mekong and Himalayan regions and its impact on livelihoods and ecosystems. One of his prominent tasks at ICRAF ECA is to establish research partnerships with institutions in Myanmar, where he currently is coordinating a project on agroforestry alternatives to shifting cultivation in the northern uplands. Dr. Schmidt-Vogt will be speaking about the future of shifting cultivation today, and we look forward to the insights he will share with us today. Please, would like to call on stage Dr. Schmidt-Vogt. Ladies and gentlemen, please give it out loud for him.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'd like to give an update on my current status, because after having worked in Asia for 15 years, 1 year ago, I returned to my home in Germany, and I'm now with Freiburg University, which is also shown on these slides. The topic that I've chosen is on a land use system that all of you will be very familiar with. You call it June in this part of the world. And in the literature, it's more generally known as shifting cultivation or swidden cultivation. I've been working on this land use system for more than 30 years on various aspects that are relating to this type of land use. I've not been working in India, but in surrounding areas of the Eastern Himalayas, like Myanmar, as was mentioned just now, but also in Thailand and in Laos and in other parts of, let's say, the greater Eastern Himalayas. And let me see. Yeah, it works. I don't have to explain June cultivation to anyone in the room. I think you're quite familiar with it. This is a picture from Thailand, which shows that a landscape that is dominated or modified by shifting cultivation is actually a largely forested landscape. No? And I would like to recall what was said this morning by Dhananda Shiva about the symbiosis between farming and forest, which I think is quite well embodied in this type of land use. Shifting cultivation, as you know, is a dynamic form of land use where forest is cut, or a part of the forest is cut and burned, and for some years cultivation takes place, can be 1 year, can be longer, and after a few years of cultivation, then the forest regenerates over a fallow period, and this can be variably long, from a few years to ideally more than 10 years. And after that, if the farmers are practicing rotational shifting cultivation, then the forest is cut again and the whole cycle resumes. This is actually the fact in this part of Thailand where I've been working, and most of the forest that you can see on this picture has been going through these cycles of, we can say, destruction or cutting down and regeneration since actually many generations. Sorry. As I mentioned, I've been working on shifting cultivation since quite a long time. At the beginning of my research, I was more interested in studying the then still existing forms of traditional shifting cultivation, which over large parts of Thailand, for instance, have vanished by now. I was working with a small group, with a small ethnic group. They were called the Lawa, who had a very interesting form of shifting cultivation. That picture was taken in 1992. The lady in the picture was the landlady of the house where I was staying. And the picture shows one of the interesting aspects of this type of land use, and that is that women actually did the work of cutting down the forests. No? There was an interesting kind of gender division between labor, and Another interesting aspect was that not all trees were cut down. So the women cut down trees of a certain diameter that was not very difficult to cut down, and quite a large number of trees were left standing. And the crop, in this case rice, as you can see below, was grown between these trees. So that's quite unique, but you can find it also in other parts of Asia. I think you can also find it here in Northeast India. The major contribution of this practice of shifting cultivation is that it creates a relatively diverse fallow forest. As I mentioned, then when the forest will grow back eventually after cultivation stops, and in sort of in a situation like this, the forest actually develops into a relatively diverse forest. And this is one of this diagram on the left side shows a transect through one of these fallow forests. You can see trees of different size. The tallest trees are those that have been left standing, and the smaller trees are those that have been growing up. It's too small to see. On the right-hand side, there is a list of species, but it's enough to say that there were 30 tree species growing up in these fallow forests. Fallow forests are also called secondary forests, which generally is associated with an idea of being, let's say, of lesser quality than a primary forest. But according to the research that I did at that time, I found that in terms of biodiversity, or say plant diversity, these secondary forests are actually quite valuable and were occasionally more species rich than nearby natural forests. We repeated the research later in 2010 with colleagues from Chiang Mai University in Thailand, and basically came up with similar findings. So in terms of conservation, the outcome of the research was that shifting cultivation is actually capable of maintaining a relatively diverse forest cover in a state of a dynamic equilibrium. And so that was one outcome of studying a traditional form of rotational swidden cultivation. In subsequent years, we got interested in, now what is happening to shifting cultivation? Traditional shifting cultivation, and you will see the same thing here in northeastern India, is actually gradually vanishing. With some colleagues, we did a global survey of the literature on shifting cultivation to find out what are globally sort of the dynamics of this land use system. And you can see here on this world map, sort of the areas in the tropics where shifting cultivation is practiced, from Latin America to Africa and to Southeast Asia. And you can see Southeast Asia. Let's see if I can get the pointer to work. Oh, sorry, that was, yeah, no, not really, but doesn't matter. You can see there is a quadrangle at the far end of this picture that actually shows Southeast Asia. It's dominated by red color, by these red triangles, and they indicate declining shifting cultivation. By comparison, when you look at Africa, when you look at Latin America, these black boxes indicate a steady state or actually increasing shifting cultivation. So that is quite unique about our situation here. Shifting cultivation is declining, and it's declining mainly for policy reasons, because governments are actually quite adverse to this type of land use, which is considered to be rather destructive. In the same publication that came out in 2012, we were also looking then into what happens then. What kind of land use follows upon shifting cultivation? And we found that the situation is actually very diverse. Yeah. And I don't want to go really into too many details here, but if you look again to the right-hand side, which shows Asia, you can see, for instance, these the circles are filled with rather different colors. So that means that in each country, something else is happening. No? Some different kind of land use or some different type of crop is following upon shifting cultivation. And I just want to illustrate it with a few photographs. The photograph on the left-hand side shows actually my former study area in Thailand, where I used to study traditional shifting cultivation. Even while I was working there, farmers stopped the type of cultivation and changed over to cash cropping for cabbage. The picture on the top right is from Vietnam, where maize monocultures follow upon shifting cultivation. And the picture down on the right bottom, that's from Xishuangbanna, Yunnan province, where I used to work for many years, where rubber plantations are the most important follow-up crop to shifting cultivation. We did some work on rubber cultivation in Xishuangbanna, and we found, first of all, that it increased rapidly. Now, if you just look at the three maps, on the left, 1988, the rubber areas are kind of shown in yellow. 2002 already increased. 2010, it's an increase by more than 5 times in a relatively short time. And it's actually more impressive even if you see what's happening on the local level. We did a comparison of 2 villages in the year 2000 and the year 2012. Now, it's again, time is too short to explain all the colors, but if you look at the top village, gray color on the left-hand side, that is actually food production. So it's rotational cropping, mainly for rice or for other food crops. And this color is replaced on the right-hand side by this kind of bluish purple color, that's all rubber. So there was a change from food cropping to cash cropping. And the same basically happened in the lower village. Sort of the pink color is replaced by the purple color. Same story, rice cultivation or maize cultivation is replaced by rubber. So it's a major change of livelihood, which of course opens up risks, such as what happens when the price drops. The price for rubber has dropped in Xishuangbanna, and people are now coping with this problem now of having given up the diversification of livelihood for making themselves dependent on one major cash crop. So, and here I would like to come to the last project that was also mentioned in the introduction. That's a project that we started in Myanmar, where all these developments are coming a little bit later. Myanmar has opened up only a few years ago. There's still a lot of traditional farming going on in the uplands of Myanmar, Chin State or Shan State, but the change is already on the horizon. And our idea was maybe to develop an alternative for farmers. Instead of changing over to monocultures for commercial cropping, maybe developing land use systems that maintain some elements of shifting cultivation that are useful or economically or ecologically sustainable and attractive to farmers. So the idea was actually then to replace shifting cultivation with agroforestry systems. And in agroforestry systems, the symbiosis between crop and tree is maintained, but in a more stable, in a more steady way. And yeah, I don't want to go into too much detail, except for one component. I mentioned that an important component of shifting cultivation landscapes are fallow forests. These forests that are regenerating between different cropping periods. And if you stabilize shifting cultivation, which means that farmers no longer cut down the forest, but they crop now permanently in the same field, what to do with these fallow forests and how to make these fallow forests useful for farmers. And one idea was, and Prabir mentioned that today, was to use these forests as sites for mushroom cultivation. That has a great tradition in China, and we also tried to transfer this idea to Myanmar. And also, this morning in the panel discussion, the lady from Nagaland also mentioned that mushrooms are an important part of the diet in Nagaland, and that there is a market potential for this crop. So mushrooms, you can say, more or less grow by themselves in secondary forests. There are ways of enhancing their growth or improving the quality. Markets need to be developed, marketing mechanisms. So we believe that there is actually cultivating mushrooms in these residual shifting cultivation forests would be a great way of making use of these shifting cultivation landscapes even after shifting cultivation in the strict sense of the word has ceased or ended. And in this sense, there may still really be a future for shifting cultivation in the sense that the symbiosis between the forest and between crops, mushrooms only one example, other crops can also be grown if this is maintained. And I would like to finish off with alerting you to a very interesting publication that's going to come out next year. That's a book edited by Malcolm Cairns, Farmer Innovations and Best Practices by Shifting Cultivators in Asia Pacific, which contains a wealth of case studies of how farmers, also on their own account, have innovated, have used sort of the basic pattern of shifting cultivation in order to create land use systems that are better adapted to the opportunities or the constraints of our current condition. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, sir. Now I open the floor for some questions to come in. So may we have a few questions, please?
I come from Nagaland, and
Right.
we are also coming from a shifting cultivation system. And so for us, we are thinking that this is also a challenge into how to sustain our shifting land. Instead of shifting it, how do we maintain that and make it more permanent? In case if it is like 3 years we change, then how can we make it into 5 years so that like the cycle will be a little longer? So in your presentation, you presented that it is a very good system in itself, and we do believe so. But now with the population increase and with many individuals privatizing the land, we are having lesser lands. So we are thinking, how can we maintain that cycle longer? So in that,
That's right.
can you just respond? Yeah.
I was very interested in what you said this morning, and that's why also I think maybe I would like to discuss this later with you in a little bit more detail. Basically, if you want to maintain shifting cultivation under conditions of growing population and reduced land resources, one way is either to stabilize it, basically give up the rotational idea, or actually to shorten rotations. This is also a way, actually, this Malcolm Cairns, you may have heard this name, he did his research in Nagaland, and he studied a very interesting shifting cultivation system that was based on Alnus nepalensis, or Utis, where a tree cover of Alnus nepalensis, which is capable of actually fertilizing the ground through nitrogen fixation, is maintained. So if you keep these trees, if you don't cut them down, but if you maintain kind of an open scattering of these trees, then he found a land use system where they were able to maintain a rotational period of 4 years, 2 years of cultivation, 2 years of fallow, and then again 2 years of cultivation without significant loss of fertilizer. So I think especially in Nagaland, there are some really interesting indigenous approaches to this problem already.
My own views are akin to her. My point is that the best process of actually shifting cultivation is because there's a cycle of between 20 and 30 years. As long as the cycle is 20 or 30 years, there should not be a challenge actually on shifting cultivation. that that's the way the nomadic form of agriculture, and that's the finest and purest form of regeneration, at least in tropical forests here. That seems to be the cycle. So I think there should not be anything really against it. But what you said actually qualifies it, saying with a growing population, it's really a challenge because the time for recycling does not happen. And actually it is shifting, and whatever little there is left, because the tribals, meaning, and I say tribals in a very modern way. I think the tribals are the most modern in terms of many things, in terms of thought, medicine, meaning cultivation. And I think what I've seen is that they know where the next horizon of fertility for soil is. And therefore they go to that forest where the fertility is. So that's really the issue. It's in a way an oxymoron, because this is right and that is right. But per se, shifting cultivation here is definitely part of the cultural ethos of doing it. But the challenge is what you said.
That's right. I'm glad you mentioned this, because there could be one argument from the perspective of land of conservation to maintain shifting cultivation in its rotational form, because it will maintain biodiversity not only within the single plot, like this plot that I showed and that I studied, but on the landscape, because you will have these disturbances shifting throughout. There is a new areas cleared. After the cultivation ends, you have the pioneer plants coming up. After 4 years, then the pioneer plants are replaced by climax species. So there is a constant turnover of species, which you lose when you stabilize the system, and basically then, and so this dynamic might be worthwhile maintaining.
So, thank you so very much, Dr. Smith. Vogt.